Few games have captured the same sense of skill and spectacle as Shadow of the Colossus, and none with a focus on improvisational combat like Eternal Strands. In its best moments, it feels pretty dang special, like when you're holding on to a towering titan for dear life, freezing its hand to its own body to get a few more hits in before dramatically leaping away. Unfortunately, that delicious center is sandwiched between frequently janky physics, a bizarre weather system, and repetitive combat against smaller enemies that doesn't evolve enough. The end result is an action RPG with high peaks and low valleys, but those valleys are still well worth braving to see the spectacular heights Eternal Strands reaches. Eternal Strands' world is well developed and rich with lore, but its story never really managed to fully sink its hooks into me. It centers around a warrior named Bryn and her band of weavers.
They've brought me here, where it all began.
Magically inclined wanderers that have been shunned by society ever since an arcane-fueled catastrophe known as the Surge. It's a fairly straightforward expedition into the unknown as you investigate questions like what caused the surge. But its biggest issue is pacing. It is dreadfully slow, with virtually no major events or revelations happening until roughly the halfway point of this 30-hour campaign. Until then, it's just a lot of chatter in your ear as you complete routine fetch quests and slowly get to know your fellow weavers.
The potential for discovery is endless.
Instead, what really makes Eternal Strands stand out is how the systems behind your various powers can interact with each other, allowing for some really creative approaches to combat and exploration. For example, one of your main abilities creates a stream of ice that can be used to freeze enemies in place, but there's thermodynamics at play as well. That means that you can use an ice wall to put out fires, cool you down, or make a piece of metal armor brittle enough to shatter. Ice walls can also connect to surfaces, allowing you to create makeshift bridges to cross large gaps, or, most impressively, pin a giant foe's arm or leg to the ground. Your other central power is telekinesis, which is far less novel, but let's be real. It's never not been fun to telekinetically pick things up and hurl them around in a video game. And again, there are other systems at play that enhance that utility. As an example, one enemy type has a magic shield that can suck up ice and fire, making your elemental spells ineffective. That is, until you intentionally allow them to suck one up, then telekinetically grab the shield and toss it back at them for a powerful explosion. Your powers really come to life when you're battling against one of Eternal Strands' great foes. These are roaming boss battles that take equal amounts of inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus and the Horizon series. You're able to freely scale these enemies as you try to make your way towards specific weak points, while they do everything they can to stop you. They'll shake wildly, cast spells, and even reach over to pluck you right off if you're not already on the move. These fights are great partially because there are so many ways to approach them. You could start from their legs and climb up their body to find and slash at their weaknesses, use your bow to hit those weak points from afar, use telekinesis to toss objects in the environment at them, freeze a body part when they slam it down to the ground to get a shortcut to their weaknesses, and the list just goes on and on. But what's really cool is that every great foe has a sort of puzzle tied to them, where if you fight them in a very specific way, you'll expose the locus of their power, which you can then climb to and harvest to upgrade the power associated with that fight. Or you can defeat them normally by depleting their health, which won't get you a power upgrade, but will get you a ton more rare crafting materials to upgrade your gear. These battles are repeatable, and it's nice to be able to make a choice on the reward you want simply by altering the way you fight. There is a decent variety across the 9 great foes that are here, but I do wish that they were more frequent and more plentiful, because they're far and away the best part of Eternal Strands. By comparison, basic combat against the smaller enemy types doesn't fare quite as well. It's fine, but also very ordinary. There are only 2 melee weapon types, you never learn any new attacks other than the ones tied to weapons, and there aren't a ton of enemy types considering how long the campaign is. It's a blow that is softened thanks to the aforementioned utility of your powers, but I often found myself wishing that traditional weapon combat had anywhere near the same flexibility and creativity. For the first 10 hours or so of Eternal Strands, everything was great. Combat and exploration stayed fresh thanks to a steady pace of new enemies, locations, weapons, bosses, and powers. Eventually though, that pace slows way down as you're regularly sent back to previous zones to fight mostly the same enemies and travel to the same locations, usually just to pick up a note or some other simple quest item. Weather events can dramatically change the way you approach these return trips, but almost never in a good way. A flash freeze makes the whole level freezing cold, enhancing your ice powers, but forcing you to equip cold-resistant clothing or drink a special potion to avoid constant damage. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom use a temperature system that's very similar, but the big difference is that those games communicate how hot and cold you are and how much resistance you actually need to avoid taking damage. Eternal Strands makes it a guessing game. Droughts aren't much more fun for the same reasons, just replace cold with heat, and the miasma event just straight up blocks off certain areas with a poisonous mist, making navigating each level a pain. As a result, I dreaded having to complete a main quest during a weather event. Fortunately, most of the time you'll be adventuring in clear skies, and at the very least, it's fun to explore under those conditions. You can climb just about any surface, and virtually everything can be broken down for crafting materials, allowing you to truly carve your own path through its open-ended playgrounds. The one downside is that there isn't that much incentive to really look deep for secrets. There are hidden shinies that unlock bits of lore in your codex, but as far as collectibles that affect gameplay go, all you'll really find are uncommon crafting parts and blueprints for new gear. The blueprints are great, don't get me wrong, especially because those pieces of gear come with unique effects, but I would have loved to have found some upgrades that increase my health, stamina, or really anything. Instead, all that progression is tied to your gear, which you can craft back at the base camp. Doing so involves a convoluted upgrade material system that I wish was simpler, but it's cool that gear never really becomes outdated. Even the starting armor can be useful throughout the whole game, with enough upgrades thanks to balance-based stats. But if you're planning on going up against a large boss that you're likely climbing on, you might want armor that boosts your stamina instead. It's a system that benefits from having armor for different occasions, which does make it a bit puzzling that there's no way to save different loadouts. Those different armor options are at least nice to look at, and in general, Eternal Strands is quite a pleasing game for the eyes and ears. The art style is very colorful with great character designs all around. It ran super smoothly on my PC regardless of how many crazy fire and ice effects were on the screen at once, and there are some great animated cutscenes that punctuate big moments. The soundtrack from Austin Wintory also hits all the right notes, especially during the great foe battles, making these larger-than-life fights feel appropriately epic. When Eternal Strands is good, it's very good, thanks to exciting boss fights that iterate upon Shadow of the Colossus' gigantic encounters better than just about any of the other games that have used it as inspiration. While its story is underwhelming and some aspects of its gear progression are especially convoluted, the combat is built on an extremely strong foundation thanks to a versatile set of powers that encourage and reward creativity, especially in the show-stopping great foe battles. The novelty does begin to fade after a while, especially when you're forced to fight those same bosses and enemies again in the same locations, occasionally with frustrating weather effects, but the high points of Eternal Strands mitigate the low points enough to still make it an action RPG that's easy to recommend. For more game reviews, make sure to check out our review for Dynasty Warriors Origins. And for everything else, keep it here on IGN.